The puck is swatted away by Ryan Kessler, only 5 ticks remaining on the clock. He fires it all the way down the ice, and that is gonna wrap this one up. The massive 11-game home winning streak officially dies tonight. And just like that, we are reminded that professional hockey is ultimately defined by split-second decisions. We are talking about those legendary flashes of absolute undeniable glory, right alongside the kinds of ugly jaw-dropping scandals that leave a bitter taste in your mouth for decades. These are the specific snapshots forever seared into the brains of die-hard puckheads everywhere. The kind of stuff you literally cannot unsee. Strap in, because we are taking a deep dive into the absolute highest highs and the absolute lowest, most despised lows in the entire history of the National Hockey League. And hey, if you are the kind of fan who lives and breathes this sport, hit that like button right now and make sure you subscribe so you never miss a single breakdown. Let's get into it. Let us kick things off with the dark side of the sport, the nightmarish incidents that will forever live in pure infamy. Flashback to March 8th, 2004, the hockey world collectively held its breath as it watched what is widely considered the most brutal, stomach-churning act of on-ice violence in modern sports history. Calling this a hockey play would be a complete joke. This was straight-up criminal assault. It was a cold, calculated revenge mission that spiraled completely out of control, violently snuffing out a promising young player's career in the blink of an eye, and slapping a massive, incredibly ugly black eye on the entire league that still has not fully faded. To really understand the bad blood, we have to rewind the tape a few weeks prior, to February 16th. Steve Moore, a gritty rookie suiting up for the Colorado Avalanche, laid an absolutely massive open ice hit on the face of the Vancouver Canucks franchise, their superstar captain Marcus Naslund. That specific collision, even though the referees staring right at it called it completely clean and within the rulebook, ended up leaving Naslund sidelined with a serious brain rattle. Over the next few days, the entire Vancouver organization was absolutely seeing red. Enraged roster guys, especially their powerhouse forward Todd Bertuzzi, stepped up to the microphones and essentially put a massive public bounty right on Steve Moore's back, making it crystal clear that the rookie was going to pay a heavy physical toll the very next time these two squads crossed paths. They were not hiding their intentions at all, so when the rematch finally rolled around, the tension inside that arena was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Throughout the game, a parade of Vancouver enforcers did everything in their power to goad Moore into dropping the gloves. But the kid flat out refused to take the bait. The Canucks, however, had zero intention of letting this slide without getting their pound of flesh. Late in the third frame, with the scoreboard completely lopsided and the game effectively over, Bertuzzi started hunting Moore down like prey. He shadowed him up, the ice grabbed a fistful of his jersey from behind, and when the rookie still refused to turn and brawl, Bertuzzi unleashed an absolute haymaker, sucker punching the unsuspecting player right in the side of the skull. It was lights out immediately. Moore was out cold before he even started to drop, and as his limp body pitched forward, the massive Vancouver enforcer used every single ounce of his 200+ pound frame to pancake the kid's unprotected face directly into the frozen rink. What followed was an absolute circus, a terrifying pile-up of massive players from both benches crushing down on top of the completely paralyzed rookie. When the dust finally settled and the bodies peeled away, the scene was straight out of a horror movie. Steve Moore was motionless, bleeding heavily onto the white ice for what felt like an eternity before medical staff finally managed to carefully strap him onto a stretcher and wheel him out of the arena. Just like that, his lifelong dream was violently ripped away. The medical report was absolutely devastating. We are talking 3 separate broken bones in his neck, a totally shattered equilibrium from massive head trauma, shredded ligaments surrounding his spine, and a lifelong sentence of post-concussion nightmares. He would literally never lace up his skates for a professional game ever again. The punishment that came down on Todd Bertuzzi was heavy and unprecedented. The league office immediately slapped him with an indefinite ban from stepping foot on the ice. A massive punishment that dragged out for 17 excruciating months, stripping him of 20 regular season matchups and sidelining him for the entire canceled 2004 to 2005 lockout year. But the league's disciplinary committee was the least of his problems. Law enforcement got involved and Bertuzzi found himself slapped with criminal assault charges, officially cited for causing serious bodily harm by the top-tier legal authorities up in British Columbia. Thus a heavy legal burden that ultimately forced him to stand in front of a judge and plead guilty. Adding financial ruin to the mix, Moore rightfully unleashed a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit targeting both the player who ruined his life and the entire Vancouver organization. A brutal legal war of attrition that completely bogged down the courts for more than 10 years before they finally hashed out a massive confidential settlement behind closed doors. Today, this ugly chapter serves as a horrifying wake-up call, proving exactly what happens when hockey's unspoken old-school justice system crosses the line into permanently destroying a young man's actual life. While a lot of the sport's darkest memories spark from two heated rivalries completely losing their minds, the next incident we are diving into is a totally different, far more sinister breed of evil. This was a straight-up predatory headhunting mission carried out by a guy who was already widely despised as one of the dirtiest repeat offenders to ever lace up skates. A single devastating cheap shot that was so overwhelmingly violent, it literally forced the front office to rewrite the entire rulebook to protect its players. Fast forward to the year 2010, Pittsburgh Penguins agitator Matt Cooke was basically public enemy number one. The guy had already cemented his legacy across the league as an absolute menace, carrying a mile-long rap sheet filled with incredibly reckless, totally gutless attempts to injure other players on the ice. Meanwhile, over in Boston, Bruins superstar center Mark Savard was absolutely tearing up the league as a premier playmaker, right at the absolute peak of his athletic prime. But when the calendar flipped to March 7th, 2010, these two entirely different forces of nature smashed into one another in a horrifying sequence that would ultimately rewrite the fundamental fabric of professional hockey. Deep into the matchup, Savard fired off a routine wrist shot toward the opposing net. Just as he completely followed through on his shooting motion, leaving his body entirely exposed and defenseless, Matt Cooke came speeding in from a total blind spot like a runaway freight train. Launching his entire body weight upward, Cooke unleashed an absolutely devastating shoulder hit that connected squarely with Savard's skull. The Bruins star was knocked out completely cold before his body even crumpled to the frozen rink, leaving him with a catastrophic grade 2 concussion. This was not just a hockey play gone wrong, it was a ruthless headhunting strike aimed at a guy who never even saw it coming. Almost immediately, an absolute firestorm of controversy erupted across the sports landscape. Back in those days, the National Hockey League's official rulebook contained a glaring, dangerous technicality. Astonishingly, nothing explicitly prohibited destroying a player with a blindside headshot, just as long as the defender used their shoulder as the primary point of impact. Exploiting that exact technicality meant that the officials on the ice did not even send Cooke to the penalty box for a single second, then sending absolute shockwaves of disgust through the entire North American hockey community. League executives decided against handing down any sort of suspension whatsoever. The resulting backlash from the public was nothing short of a tidal wave. Die-hard supporters in the stands, SportsCenter analysts, and even fellow players were boiling over with rage that such a vicious, intent-to-injure cheap shot one that scrambled the brains of an all-star was somehow considered perfectly legal under the current guidelines. This sickening collision finally pushed the league past the breaking point regarding their long-simmering epidemic of traumatic brain injuries. For Marc Savard, the personal fallout was absolutely heartbreaking. He gave everything he had to make a heroic comeback the very next year. But the lingering, debilitating nightmares of post-concussion syndrome were just too immense to overcome, forcing him to hang up his skates way before his time. However, the unprecedented collective outrage over the incident and the front office's failure to discipline Cooke essentially backed the league into a corner, leaving them no choice but to drop the hammer. Before the puck even dropped on the following campaign, the top brass officially rolled out Rule 48. A groundbreaking mandate specifically designed to ban any lateral or blindside checks where the cranium takes the brunt of the punishment. Watching Cooke demolish Savard still stands as one of the ugliest, most despised sequences you will ever see on a sheet of ice. But it undeniably served as the spark that ignited one of the single most crucial shifts in player safety regulations that modern professional hockey has ever witnessed. Now it is worth noting that not every infamous blood-boiling memory in this sport stems from a vicious physical assault. Every so often, the deepest, most agonizing rage is triggered by a referee's whistle, a completely botched call, or a blown penalty that totally alters the destiny of a championship series, leaving an entire devoted fan base feeling absolutely robbed for generations to come. Flashback to the late 1990s, a notorious stretch affectionately dubbed the dead puck era by fans. It was a grueling period where lighting the lamp felt almost impossible, and suffocating trap-style defensive schemes completely dominated the sport. When playing in a system that tight finding the back of the net was worth its weight in gold. Which perfectly set the ultimate stage for Lord Stanley's Cup to be decided by a scenario so incredibly polarizing and so unbelievably maddening that true fans to this day simply refer to it using two dreaded words: no goal. The real antagonist in this chapter was not a goon on the ice, but a wildly unpopular piece of legislation. During the 1998 to 1999 campaign, the front office cracked down hard on their infamous skate in the crease policy. There was zero wiggle room when it came to enforcing this mandate. If an offensive player had so much as a toenail of his blade touching the blue paint of the goaltender's crease before the puck crossed the goal line, the score was instantly wiped off the board. The officials did not care one bit whether the attacker had actually bumped into the netminder or not. They completely ignored whether the player was forcefully shoved in there by a defenseman. If a boot was in the paint, the play was dead and the goal was garbage. Throughout the entire regular season, crowds and players alike were pulling their hair out as beautiful scoring plays were erased over the absolute tiniest, most microscopic violations imaginable. That agonizing tension brings our story right into Game 6 of the 1999 Stanley Cup Final, a heavyweight bout featuring the Dallas Stars squaring off against the Buffalo Sabres. This matchup turned into an absolute defensive meat grinder, dragging exhausted players deep into a nerve-wracking third overtime period. The stakes were astronomical. The very next player to put the puck in the net was going home with the greatest trophy in all of sports. Deep into that sudden death frame, Dallas sniper Brett Hull managed to wrangle a wild rebound right on the doorstep of the crease. Brett Hull corralled the loose puck with his skate, deftly kicked it onto the blade of his stick, and snapped a shot right past the outstretched pads of a desperately sprawling Dominik Hasek. The red lamp glowing behind the net signaled the end of the marathon. Total pandemonium erupted as the entire Dallas roster spilled over the boards, launching their sticks and gloves high into the rafters to celebrate capturing hockey's ultimate prize. However, it took only a few seconds for every single soul packed into that arena, along with millions of stunned viewers sitting on their living room couches, to catch the slow motion replay, and the visual evidence was absolutely indisputable. Hull's left boot was blatantly planted deep inside the blue paint of the goaltender's crease long before the puck ever crossed the goal line. Based on the exact letter of the law that league officials had ruthlessly penalized all year long, this was a dead play and a completely illegal sequence. That entire Buffalo roster was absolutely dead set in their belief that the officials would wave off the score, allowing the marathon game to continue. Following an agonizingly stressful trip to the video monitors, the War Room delivered a jaw-dropping final ruling. The call on the ice was confirmed as a good hockey goal, instantly crowning Dallas as the undisputed kings of the National Hockey League. Up in upstate New York, an entire community was plunged into a nightmare cocktail of pure disbelief and absolute rage, especially after hearing the totally mind-boggling justification handed down by the league brass. League executives insisted that some obscure, never-before-heard interpretation of the official rulebook magically made the sequence perfectly legal, arguing that the legendary sniper somehow maintained continuous possession and control of the puck throughout the entire scramble. It was a highly convenient technicality that literally nobody in the hockey world, from the guys wearing the stripes, to the veteran bench bosses, to the guys calling the game up in the broadcast booth, had ever been briefed on. To the average American sports fan, it seriously looked like the powers that be were just pulling a wild excuse out of thin air to legitimize a chaotic, series-clinching sudden death victory. The fallout from this massive scandal became such a public relations disaster that the front office completely scrubbed the notorious crease infraction regulation from the books before the puck dropped on the very next campaign. This sudden policy change served as a glaringly transparent confession that the league office had completely blown the call under the brightest spotlight the sport could possibly offer. Now we pivot to what is universally considered the single most agonizing alternate history scenario in the modern era of the Toronto franchise. We are talking about one historically catastrophic missed whistle that totally flipped the momentum of a brutal postseason war, shielded hockey's most recognizable icon from punishment, and absolutely shattered the spirits of the most fiercely loyal and hockey-crazed demographic on the face of the planet. The calendar year was 1993. The setting was a do-or-die Game 6 in the Western Conference Showdown, pitting the gritty blue-collar Toronto squad against the glitz and glamour of Wayne Gretzky and his Hollywood-backed Los Angeles roster. Riding the hot hand of their fearless, battle-tested captain Doug Gilmour, the boys in blue and white held a massive 3-2 advantage in the best-of-7 slugfest. They found themselves exactly one victory away from booking their very first trip to the championship round in 26 agonizingly long years. The entire metropolitan area up north was absolutely vibrating with a nervous electric energy. The matchup itself was an incredibly tight, heavy-hitting roller coaster ride that ultimately required sudden death overtime to find a winner. Just moments into the fourth period, the Great One himself, the most dominant athlete to ever lace up a pair of skates, completely lost control of his stick, violently catching Gilmour right across the jawline, dropping the Toronto captain to the frozen canvas instantly, with blood dripping from a nasty gash on his chin. Television replays showed it without a shadow of a doubt it was a blatant, reckless, high-sticking infraction that drew blood. According to the strict guidelines governing the sport during that specific era, and the sequence demanded an automatic 5-minute major penalty coupled with a mandatory game misconduct, meaning the undisputed face of the league should have been immediately sent to the locker room for the night. Inexplicably, the man calling the shots on the ice, veteran referee Kerry Fraser, who was widely regarded as one of the sharpest and most seasoned officials in the business, somehow kept his whistle in his pocket and let the play continue without a single infraction assessed. The building was in a state of absolute jaw-dropping shock, because instead of heading to a massive 5-minute man advantage to punch their ticket to the finals, the hometown squad was forced to watch helplessly as the most lethal playmaker in hockey history stayed out on the ice to continue his shift. Only seconds after the bloody non-call, the superstar capitalized on the chaos, bearing the golden goal to end the game. And pushing the series to a massive winner-take-all Game 7, which the California franchise would ultimately dominate on home ice to steal the championship berth. That legendary blown whistle during Game 6 is still viewed by that heartbroken fan base as the exact devastating instant where the sports gods outright stole a guaranteed title run right out from under them. This absolute disaster of officiating has carved its name into sports infamy, fueling endless hours of bitter sports radio debates, tinfoil hat conspiracies, and generational trauma for decades. Long after hanging up his skates, the referee actually took to his personal column to come clean, publicly confessing that he completely missed the call and made a colossal error. However, for the deeply scarred diehards up north, an apology written years down the road was way too little, way too late. It remains one of the most utterly despised. We are talking about one of those monumental franchise-shattering events where a heavily disputed call ended up shielding an absolute icon while simultaneously ripping the heart right out of an entire city. And that brings me to you. Drop it in the comments right now. What is the single most infuriating blown call or scandal in hockey history that you will never, ever forgive? Let's hear it. I want to know what still keeps you up at night. Yet the beauty of the sport dictates that for every dark memory permanently etched in infamy, there is an equally brilliant counterpart bathed in eternal glory. Whenever you find a tale riddled with soul-crushing heartbreak and bitter controversy, you will inevitably uncover another instance overflowing with raw, completely unscripted euphoria. These extreme highs and devastating lows serve as the ultimate reminder of exactly why we invest our entire souls into the great game of hockey. Throughout the vast, sprawling history of North American athletics, countless millions of photographs have been snapped by eager reporters along the sidelines. However, you can count on two hands the number of snapshots that truly transcend the boundaries of the rink, embedding themselves permanently into our collective cultural consciousness. When it comes to the frozen battleground of ice hockey, one legendary photograph reigns supreme over absolutely everything else. That is the exact split second when the great Bobby Orr defied gravity and took flight. To understand the magnitude of this snapshot, we have to travel back to the gritty streets of Boston in the year 1970. Despite holding the prestigious status as one of the National Hockey League's revered Original Six franchises, the Bruins had been painfully wandering through a barren championship drought for 29 agonizingly long years. But the roster that laced up their skates that particular season possessed an entirely different kind of undeniable hardcore magic. They were fiercely anchored by a trailblazing young defenseman by the name of Bobby Orr, a phenom who was actively rewriting the fundamental rules of the sport. He completely transformed how blue liners operated, injecting a level of blazing speed and terrifying offensive firepower that the old school establishment had never encountered before. The entire greater Boston area was vibrating with an electric sense of anticipation, fully convinced that their decades of agonizing suffering were finally coming to an end. The ultimate stage was primed on May 10th, 1970. It was Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Final, pitting the heavily favored Bruins against the fiercely competitive St. Louis Blues. Boston had pushed their opponents directly to the absolute brink, sitting just one single victory away from securing a completely dominant 4-game sweep. Inside the historic confines of the Boston Garden, the atmosphere was absolute dynamite, practically bursting at the seams with nearly 3 decades of desperate pent-up hometown yearning. Regulation play proved to be an incredibly nerve-wracking, tightly contested slugfest that eventually ground to a stubborn, breathless deadlock. This tense stalemate violently shoved the contest into sudden death overtime, meaning the very next time the puck found the back of the net, the Stanley Cup would officially be awarded. The hometown crowd hardly had time to hold their collective breath. A mere 40 seconds into the sudden death period, Orr ignited a brilliantly executed give-and-go sequence with his trusted teammate Derek Sanderson. Charging like a freight train straight through the slot, Orr drove hard to the crease and collected the crisp return feed right on the tape of his stick. With the lightning-fast reflexes of a gunslinger, he smoothly slipped the puck right past the sprawling pads of legendary St. Louis goaltender Glenn Hall. The red goal light immediately flashed, the grueling physical battle was instantly over, and the Boston Bruins were officially crowned the undisputed champions of the hockey universe. However, the physical mechanics of what transpired in that exact microscopic fraction of a second is what elevated a standard championship clincher into an immortal piece of athletic mythology. Right as the young superstar released his historic shot, St. Louis enforcer Noel Picard desperately jammed his stick into Orr's skates, trying to rip him down to the ice. That massive collision launched the Boston legend completely airborne, catapulting him high into the arena's humid, hazy atmosphere. He hovered there for a fleeting moment like a comic book superhero, his entire frame suspended totally parallel to the freezing rink below him. Throwing his arms wide open in a majestic, gravity-defying pose of absolute victory, he celebrated the exact millisecond the puck violently crossed the fateful goal line. This breathtaking instance of athletic perfection was flawlessly frozen in time by the incredibly sharp lens of visionary photographer Ray Bourque. That single shutter click birthed what is universally recognized as the single most iconic visual in the entire history of the sport, a spectacular combination of raw power, poetic grace, and unadulterated jubilation. Today, that legendary airborne celebration has been forever immortalized as a massive bronze monument standing proudly as a sentinel right outside the modern-day TD Garden. It stands today as a permanent ironclad homage, paying respects to the exact second a true giant of the game completely broke the curse. By ending that devastating 29-year dry spell, he inadvertently sculpted a flawless, timeless masterpiece of athletic pop culture in the process. This was never just about putting vulcanized rubber into a net, it was the ultimate defining exclamation point of a complete positional revolution on the ice. Yet the folklore of the ice is not solely built on these flashes of instantaneous, spectacular, high-flying brilliance. Sometimes the true magic lies at the very end of an agonizing 22-year odyssey through the darkest trenches of professional sports. This brings us to a saga defined by unbreakable loyalty, relentless grit, and what ultimately stands as one of the most profoundly moving displays of pure class the National Hockey League has ever witnessed. If you ask an entire generation of die-hard puck fanatics, they will point to one specific scene that never fails to bring tears to their eyes. Watching a grizzled, battle-worn Ray Bourque finally hoist Lord Stanley's chalice straight up to the rafters remains one of the most viscerally emotional and undeniably powerful spectacles in the archives of athletics. For an unbelievable 21 campaigns, this man served as the absolute heart, soul, and living, breathing legend of the Boston Bruins organization. He wore the captain's letter with unmatched honor, guided the locker room through thick and thin, and secured a rock-solid argument as the single greatest skater to ever lace up for the historic franchise. His trophy case was absolutely overflowing with prestigious hardware, having claimed 5 separate Norris trophies, officially recognizing him as the league's ultimate shutdown defenseman. On top of being the premier defender on the ice, he eventually hung up his skates, holding the legendary title of the highest scoring blue liner to ever play the professional game. Bourque had literally accomplished every single objective a human being could possibly achieve on a sheet of ice, with one massive glaring exception haunting his legacy. His name was tragically missing from the ultimate holy grail of hockey. By the year 2000, the veteran was pushing 39 years of age, and his beloved Boston squad was trapped in a heavy rebuild miles away from sniffing a championship. Faced with a totally gut-wrenching and highly emotional crossroads, the front office in Massachusetts made an incredibly unselfish and frankly unheard of executive decision to grant their hometown hero one final shot at reaching the mountaintop. Driven by an almost unprecedented level of profound respect for their long-suffering and legendary franchise captain, the front office made the agonizing decision to trade him away to an absolute juggernaut of an organization, the Colorado Avalanche, desperately hoping to grant him one final legitimate shot at hoisting the elusive championship trophy that had tragically slipped through his fingers his entire professional career. This monumental front office move was surprisingly championed by the notoriously tough and fiercely loyal Boston fan base. A crowd that practically worshipped Ray Bourque with such relentless intensity that they were actually entirely willing to stomach the heartbreak of seeing him skate out in a rival team's sweater, just as long as it meant the war-torn veteran could finally realize his ultimate dream. In the spring of 2001, after grinding out an arduous bruising full-length season in Denver, the career-defining moment finally arrived. The heavily favored Avalanche squad, fiercely commanded by their stoic and legendary leader Joe Sakic, successfully clawed their way into the Stanley Cup Finals to face off against the absolute defensive nightmare that was the New Jersey Devils. What followed was a brutally grueling back-and-forth bloodbath of a series that ultimately pushed both battered rosters into a massive winner-take-all Game 7, which the Avalanche miraculously survived. And just like that, after 22 agonizingly long and physical seasons, Ray Bourque could finally crown himself a genuine, undisputed Stanley Cup champion. However, the single most iconic image in modern hockey history had yet to unfold, waiting until the league commissioner awkwardly slid the massive silver chalice over to Avalanche captain Joe Sakic. Literally everyone watching across the globe fully expected Sakic to hoist the hardware above his head, first blindly adhering to the fiercely guarded and sacred league tradition reserved strictly for the captain of the victorious squad. Yet in an absolute twist of fate, Sakic displaying an unbelievably raw act of pure unadulterated class and total selflessness shattered that century-old tradition entirely. Without so much as a single second of hesitation or a selfish glance at the cameras, he firmly grabbed the massive trophy and passed it straight into the hands of the 40-year-old Bourque, intentionally stepping aside so the battered veteran could be the very first man to thrust it toward the rafters. The incredibly moving image of a deeply tearful, utterly triumphant Ray Bourque, finally hoisting 35 pounds of polished silver high above his head, remains permanently burned into the memory of anyone who calls themselves a sports fan. It served as the absolute perfect Hollywood-style fairy tale conclusion to an undeniably legendary athletic career, sparking a powerful moment of profound sportsmanship that completely transcended bitter team rivalries and was universally celebrated from coast to coast. Now, while some historic events are cherished purely for their heavy emotional weight, others cement their legacy through sheer heart-stopping and absolutely unbelievable on-ice drama. We are talking about a solitary, lightning-fast shot destined to claim absolute victory on the globe's most intimidating stage, coupled with a comeback so remarkably courageous that it completely elevated the narrative far beyond the violent game of hockey itself. Every so often, there are explosive moments in the world of professional sports that genuinely feel as though they were ripped straight out of an overly dramatic, big-budget Hollywood screenplay. They feature a flawlessly executed storybook ending that feels almost entirely too immaculate, and frankly far too perfect to actually be real. On the high-stakes afternoon of February 28, 2010, Sidney Crosby stepped up and forcefully delivered one of those exact jaw-dropping moments, ripping a single desperate shot that instantly validated the suffocating hopes of an entire frantic nation and birthed an immortal sports legend. The unbelievably high-stakes battleground was set during the absolute peak of the gold medal championship clash at the 2010 Winter Olympic Games hosted in Vancouver. The final tournament matchup was the absolute ultimate mouth-watering dream scenario that television executives practically beg for behind closed doors. You had Team Canada battling fiercely on their home ice, suffocating under the impossibly heavy and crushingly immense pressure of an entire wildly expectant country sitting squarely on their bruised shoulders. Aggressively facing off against their absolute most hated and dangerous geographical rival, the powerhouse roster of Team USA. Make no mistake, this was significantly more than just another standard run-of-the-mill hockey game. It rapidly morphed into a massive cultural phenomenon, cementing itself as one of the most intensely watched, relentlessly hyped, and deeply anticipated clashes in the entire history of the sport. For the die-hard Canadian citizens, securing that gold medal on their own frozen turf was absolutely never just a casual hope, it was a viciously demanded, non-negotiable national expectation. The contest itself was a brutally tense, extremely physical, back-and-forth blood pressure spiker. With merely a few agonizingly slow minutes remaining in the third period, Canada was desperately clinging to a fragile 2-1 advantage. The completely unglued home crowd packed inside the Vancouver arena was already up on their feet, screaming their lungs out and anxiously counting down the final ticking seconds to an explosive alcohol-soaked gold medal street celebration. But then, out of absolutely nowhere, with exactly 25 devastating seconds left on the stadium clock, an absolute doomsday nightmare scenario violently ripped through the building. United States forward Zach Parise miraculously found a loose bouncing puck in the chaos of the crease, and ruthlessly shoved it past the sprawling goaltender into the back of the net, viciously tying up the score and instantly sending a massive suffocating shockwave of dead-stunned silence echoing throughout the packed arena, forcing the epic war into a completely terrifying, nail-biting sudden death overtime period. The sheer suffocating level of anxiety and tension trapped inside that sweltering building was so incredibly thick and unbearably heavy, you could practically cut it with a freshly sharpened skate blade. Every single zone entry, every desperate rush, and every blindingly fast slap shot carried the terrifying potential to abruptly end the tournament in a heartbeat. But exactly 7 grueling minutes into the extra frame, the ultimate destiny-defining moment finally arrived. Sidney Crosby, the generational superstar talent, who had been relentlessly targeted and viciously dragged by intense media scrutiny for producing a shockingly quiet tournament up to that breaking point, suddenly hopped over the bench boards and fiercely exploded straight into the offensive battle zone, as he aggressively accelerated toward the opposing crease with the panicked eyes of the entire world burning a hole in his back. The tension was so thick it was suffocating. Crosby screamed out to his linemate Jaromir Iginla, hollering that legendary call, Iggy, grinding it out in the corner against the boards. Iginla somehow managed to thread an absolute beauty of a pass directly into the high danger scoring area, not even taking a fraction of a second to think it over or settle the puck. Sidney Crosby unleashed a lightning-fast snapshot that somehow managed to squeak right between the pads of the phenomenal United States netminder Ryan Miller. The second that iconic red goal light illuminated the arena, the sudden death overtime was officially history. Team Canada had just secured the ultimate prize, claiming the Olympic gold medal on home soil. The absolute eruption of sheer pandemonium and unfiltered ecstasy from the roaring crowd created a wall of sound that was downright ear-shattering. Launching his stick and gloves high into the rafters, Crosby ignited a frenzied, chaotic celebration, a snapshot of pure athletic glory that sports networks would continuously broadcast for generations to come. Immediately etched into the history books as the golden goal, that single flick of the wrist sparked an unprecedented coast-to-coast celebration that had the entire Canadian nation spilling into the streets. It served as the absolute ultimate climax to an incredibly high-stakes, nerve-wracking international tournament that had millions gripping the edges of their seats. An instantly mythic clutch performance orchestrated by the undisputed poster boy of the National Hockey League, stepping up right when his homeland was desperately banking on him to deliver. To this very day, that freezing February afternoon stands tall as arguably the single most spectacular and universally cherished chapter in the entire history of Canadian athletics. While certain chapters in hockey lore earned their legendary status simply because of the sheer thrill of a championship win, other narratives cut entirely deeper. The following story earns its immortality through an unbelievable display of human willpower and resilience. It goes down as one of the most intensely moving, relentlessly brave, and universally inspiring tales of overcoming adversity that anyone has ever witnessed in the entire landscape of major professional athletics. It was an occurrence that entirely shattered the bitter tribalism of sports rivalries, serving as a powerful wake-up call to fans everywhere about the genuine definition of unyielding fortitude, right smack in the middle of the 1992 to 1993 National Hockey League campaign. The Pittsburgh Penguins franchise savior Mario Lemieux was operating at a god-tier level of athletic dominance that left defenders looking absolutely foolish. The man was cruising toward a historically mind-boggling offensive output, putting up numbers so downright ridiculous that he was legitimately threatening to shatter the untouchable records held by Wayne Gretzky himself. Out of absolutely nowhere, however, everything came crashing to a devastating halt. Right as he was orchestrating this masterpiece of a season, the entire sports community was broadsided and left entirely speechless by a genuinely heartbreaking press conference. Doctors had officially diagnosed the superstar forward with Hodgkin's lymphoma, plunging him into an immediate and terrifying battle against a vicious form of cancer. In the blink of an eye, the conversation shifted from chasing scoring titles to a desperate fight for his very survival, putting both his legendary career and his life on the line. Stripped of his skates and uniform, he had zero choice but to step away from the locker room to endure an absolutely punishing, physically draining gauntlet of radiation therapy. Fans, players, and analysts alike sat with bated breath, holding out hope for a miracle recovery while glued to every single medical update, yet quietly terrified that they might be losing one of the most majestic talents to ever lace up skates. Then, on March 2nd, 1993, the exact same date as his final round of brutal radiation, the Penguins captain pulled off a move so mind-blowing that it defied every single law of medical science and human endurance. He literally walked out of the hospital, boarded a private jet straight to the city of brotherly love, and shocked the entire globe by declaring he was suiting up that very evening to clash with Pittsburgh's most vicious blood feud enemy, the Philadelphia Flyers. The scene that unfolded next was an unparalleled display of profound sportsmanship that permanently etched itself into the memories of every single person watching the broadcast. The second number 66 glided his way out of the visitors' tunnel and onto the frozen surface for his opening shift. That famously ruthless and deeply unforgiving crowd packing the Philadelphia arena, a hardcore group of diehards legendary for relentlessly heckling their own, collectively stood up from their seats. They showered the returning hero with an incredibly lengthy, tear-jerking, and deafening roar of absolute approval. For those few electric minutes, the bitter cross-state hatred completely vanished. All that remained in the building was an overwhelming sense of reverence for the sheer guts and indestructible willpower of a titan who was staring down a life-or-death battle. And then, as if the moment wasn't cinematic enough, the legendary center proceeded to put on an absolute masterclass of a hockey game. Even though his body was completely ravaged by the toxicity of the cancer treatments, he flew around the rink as if he hadn't missed a single day of practice. He casually buried a puck in the back of the net and racked up a helper, delivering a jaw-dropping performance that left seasoned analysts shaking their heads in sheer disbelief. The sheer momentum of his heroic comeback was so overwhelmingly electrifying that it catapulted him into an absolutely insane highlight reel offensive rampage for the remainder of the regular season. And against all statistical odds, even after being forced to sit out a massive 24 matchups to fight for his actual life, he completely defied logic, closing the gap to capture the prestigious Art Ross Trophy as the top point getter in the entire National Hockey League. It stands as a monumental achievement of raw athletic genius and pure unadulterated grit that still totally breaks the brains of modern sports historians. Today, it solidly holds its ground as one of the most insanely gutsy, intensely emotional, and universally respected chapters across the entire spectrum of athletic competition. He grabs the breakaway, turning on the jets as he rockets down the ice with no one in front of him. Firing his very first offensive strike on the net, he absolutely buries it for a legendary goal. And that wraps up our deep dive into the vault, the heart-wrenching tragedies that brought us to our knees, alongside the miraculous triumphs that proved magic is very real on the ice. We plunged headfirst into the absolute most brutal, blood-spilling brawls and league-shaking scandals, all the way to those glorious tear-jerking instances where sheer guts and championship glory take center ice. These are those unforgettable raw snapshots, frozen in time, permanently etched into the very soul of absolutely anyone who has ever watched a puck drop or heard the loud crunch of skates on a fresh rink. Yet the fierce, passionate arguments echoing through crowded sports bars and living rooms across the nation are never truly settled when the final horn sounds. When it all comes down to the wire, which historic franchise do you proudly bleed for through thick and thin? And on the flip side of that fierce rivalry, which specific squad do you absolutely despise with every fiber of your being, happily booing them right out of the building until your voice goes completely raw? Drop your answers in the comments, I want to hear all of it. And if this video fired you up the way hockey always does, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. We will see you on the next one.